Thank you for coming, everybody. I'm going to start by reading briefly from the book. This is from the beginning of the book. And this is a book where I hope that we can look at language in a happier way than we're often trained to. So this is a happy book. And this is how it starts out. Introduction. Page through a grand old book on what was once known as natural history, as we all so often do, and you'll find that almost all drawings of marine life are rendered from the perspective of someone standing on the shore. There'll be some fish bobbing around out in the waves, and maybe some flying fish doing what they do. But clams, squids, sea anemones, and such will be lying on the beach, or artfully positioned on conveniently placed rock formations, or even just dangling from the margins of the picture. This was standard procedure in illustration until past the middle of the 19th century. It all looks nice enough, but wouldn't it seem more natural to draw a squid swimming in the water, springy, fierce, and alert, instead of putrefying on a rock? But then, what was natural to someone in 1840? Even if they were a naturalist. One thing that wasn't natural, if you think about it, was imagining what an underwater scene looked like for a simple reason. People back then didn't have the technology to ever be underwater for very long, and certainly not to be able to see much while even making a stab at it. There were no diving bells or submarines. You might take a deep breath and hold your nose and dive under for a look, but water is often muddy and it's hard to see through it when it's moving. Plus, you can only hold your breath for so long, and certainly not long enough to plunge a mile down and get a peep at anglerfishes and such. In England, it was only after a home aquarium mania in the 1850s that people started to get a sense of what aquatic creatures looked like in life, such that illustrators began drawing underwater marine scenes. Before this, as modern as the British were in so many ways, even those with advanced educations, 3 names, and salad forks, had no way of picturing undersea life in the Jacques Cousteau style that's second nature to us. To start thinking of sea creatures that way, you had to see them that way. And in many ways, quite often, to be a linguist is to feel like you're underwater in 1840, while everybody else is up on the beach laying jellyfish out onto rocks. It's because so much about language is so hard to see or hear. So from what it's easy to see and hear, we learn that they're languages, and then in many parts of the world they're assorted dialects. And these dialects are in some sense lesser than languages. Part of the difference would seem due to the fact that, as one typically supposes, a language is a collection of words. English has enough words to fill a doorstop like the Oxford English Dictionary. Some dialect out there in the rainforest doesn't, and therefore qualifies as something different from, well, a language. And then there's the writing issue. If a language isn't fixed on the page, then surely we suppose it has not achieved its full power. A certain transiency hangs about it. It's just a dialect, in other words. Because of this, it becomes natural that, if asked which was more complex, French or the language of a tiny group in New Guinea called the Nasioi, most people would immediately suppose that the answer was French, a developed language, after all. The truth, however, begins with the observation that if you thought French's 2 genders were annoying, imagine having to deal with Nasioi's 100 genders. Down underwater, what we see is a world with 6,000 languages, period, whether or not they ever see the printed page, and even if their vocabularies number only in the tens of thousands. If anything, the languages that are a little subordinary or a little special, as we might designate a certain congenitally ungifted sort of person, are typically the rock star ones like English and French and Mandarin Chinese. But who'd know? We will never meet a Nasioi, much less have any reason to learn the language. And besides, we're too busy attending to other notions about our own language, such as that one of the gravest flaws of the Anglophone is a noisome propensity to use the language illogically. We're taught that a language is sensible, tidy, such that we treat it as an oddity that English is shot through with random inconsistencies. Richard Lederer has heightened the festivity quotient of many an email inbox via excerpts that get around from his crazy English book. along the lines of, why are loosen and unloosen the same? Or if we conceive a conception and receive it a reception, then why don't we grieve aggreption? Or observations such as that there's no egg in eggplant and no ham in a hamburger. This stuff is, in fact, but the tip of an iceberg of nonsensicality in English. Underwater, you can see the rest. But we humans are terrestrial, not to mention territorial. Don't even get most of us started on what happens when languages mix together. Spanish, full of English words, is Spanglish, reviled by many and thought of as an issue by others. And there was even a time when more than a few had a serious problem with English having taken on so many words from French and Latin. After all, a real language is pure. Here's what it feels like to be underwater. One reads a perfectly pleasant newspaper article about people in the Caucasus Mountains, a patch of a region home to several dozen languages. The one closest to famous is Georgian. One of the other ones mentioned in the article, spoken only by about 1,200 people in a few villages, is called, for our purposes, Archie. And in the article, what do we learn about Archie? Only that it's a language of unknown origin. And otherwise, the article is about jokes Archie people and nearby Caucasian language-speaking groups tell about one another. I'm not waiting for a newspaper writer to give a linguistics lesson about Archie, but given the on-the-beach perspective on language that reigns, it's hard not to feel like something has happened when a language like this is flagged in passing, especially as some orphan. Attention must be paid, if not in the article, then somewhere. That unknown origin business, for example, with the quiet implication that as a kinless sort of thing, Archie is all alone, as unclassable as it is unknown, outside of the light, less than something, a dialect, perhaps. To be sure, if the idea is that a language's origins must be on paper, then Archie is lost indeed. It's been a spoken language rather than a written one, like all but about 200 of the world's 6,000 languages. But paper isn't the only way to tell where a language came from. A group of similar languages, such as French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, begin as one language, which splits off into several when populations become separated over time. Linguists can compare the word for something in related languages and deduce what the word was in the parent language. Now we know that method works pretty well in cases where even the parent language was written down for posterity. For example, hand is main in French, mano in Spanish and Italian, mão in Portuguese, mana in Romanian. No linguist is surprised, based on the techniques of what's called comparative reconstruction, that the Latin word for hand is manus. In the same way, Archie is one of a passel of kittens, a language family called, for whatever it's worth, Northeast Caucasian. If the word for tongue is mats in Archie, which it is, and mot in Chechen, and maz in Lak, and mez in Lesgian, and mitz in Bieszta, and mots in Batspi, and muz in Udi, and mitzi in Tindi, and so on, then linguists can use all of those words and roll back the tape and see that the original word in the parent language was maji, even though that language was never written down. So Archie is not of unknown origin at all. It has kin, sprung from a paterfamilias language probably spoken about 6,000 years ago. If anything, it's of better known origin than most of us are as people. Most of us have no records of our ancestors further back than 4 or 5 generations, and certainly couldn't reconstruct them from our DNA and our relatives. The world is bursting with language families of this kind, whose ancestral languages can be reconstructed in the same way as the Caucasian word above. That's enough from the book. Anyway, the book starts out like that, and that is just the introduction. And what the point of the book is to show that there is a world of wonders out there linguistically that it's hard to get a sense of because we don't know what people are saying and we don't encounter a lot of those languages. But it's really as amazing as the variety of flora and fauna out there. And once we realize that there are 6,000 truly fierce languages out there, instead of there being maybe 100 languages and then a whole bunch of dialects, then we're in a position to understand a lot of things about English that are harder to understand if we think that English is a normal language. So just by way of preview, one of the main points of the book is that if you go to a place where about 2,000 people are speaking a language, you've never heard of it, nor has anybody else, it's never been written down, then an understandable idea might be that that must be a language that's less sophisticated in some way than Japanese or Spanish or some